cold rain slaps the cracked sidewalk outside the Briar Hollow Diner, soaking through Ace Caleb Mercer's jacket as he shoves the door open with his shoulder. He's late coming back from his shift, his phone still warm in his hand from the babysitter's frantic call. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee and fried onions hangs heavy in the air. Conversations dip when he steps in. Near the last booth, Naomi Wright stands half-frozen, her coat still on, her face tight with embarrassment. A little girl clings to her leg, knuckles white, eyes wide and unsure. Caleb's stomach drops. She brought her daughter. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't prepared for the looks already cutting across the room. A plate clatters behind the counter. Someone sighs loudly. The diner manager narrows his eyes, tapping a pen against the order pad like a warning. This isn't a place for complications. Not tonight. Not for a man already hanging by a thread. Rain drums harder against the windows, loud enough to feel like judgment. Caleb exhales, steadying himself. He sees the fear in the child's eyes before he sees anything else. The manager opens his mouth to speak. Caleb steps forward. Subscribe to JustDadThings for more powerful single dad stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Caleb Mercer's days started before the sun and ended long after his body gave up asking for rest. The alarm went off at 4:30 every morning, the same cracked phone buzzing on the nightstand beside a stack of unpaid envelopes. He never hit snooze. He couldn't afford to. By 5, he was already moving through the small rental house, careful with every step so the floorboards wouldn't wake. Alex too early. The kitchen light flickered when he turned it on. He made toast because it was cheap, oatmeal because it stretched, and eggs only on Fridays when his paycheck hadn't already been claimed by rent and utilities. Eli padded in most mornings with his hair sticking up and his backpack dragging behind him, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Caleb always knelt to Eli's level before anything else. Lunchbox. Homework folder. A quick hug that lingered just a second longer than necessary. It was their routine, and routine was everything. 6 years old was old enough to understand when money was tight, even if Caleb tried to hide it. Eli noticed the grocery list getting shorter. He noticed when Caleb said next time instead of yes. What he didn't notice, what Caleb worked himself to exhaustion to prevent, was fear. Because fear in a child stuck. Fear grew roots. After breakfast came the drive to school in Caleb's aging pickup, the heater rattling louder than the engine. They passed the same cracked billboard every morning, the same empty lot where a store used to be. Caleb watched Eli disappear through the school doors and always waited until the bell rang before driving away, just in case his son turned back looking for him. Then came the manufacturing plant. The building was old, tired, and limping along just like the town. As maintenance supervisor, Caleb was responsible for keeping machines older than he was running with parts that should have been replaced years ago. He worked with grease-stained hands, a notebook full of quick fixes, and the constant awareness that one serious failure could shut everything down and take his job with it. The paycheck barely covered rent. Some months it didn't. Caleb was already 2 weeks behind, the landlord's polite reminders growing sharper. He'd sold his wedding ring years ago. He'd sold tools, furniture, even his old guitar. Pride had gone early. Survival stayed. Eli's mother had died in a highway accident 3 years ago, a call that split Caleb's life into before and after. 1 minute, he was a husband planning a family vacation. The next, he was a single father standing in a hospital hallway that smelled like antiseptic and finality. Since then, every decision he made ran through one filter. Will this keep Eli safe? That's why his biggest fear wasn't failing. It was disruption. A missed paycheck didn't just mean stress. It meant moving schools. It meant Eli losing friends. It meant bedtime routines breaking, stability cracking, and questions Caleb wasn't sure he could answer without his voice shaking. So Caleb didn't date. He didn't even think about it. not because he didn't want companionship, but because wanting something for himself felt dangerous, selfish, risky. Every woman he'd tried to talk to eventually asked the same questions. How old is your kid? Where's his mom? Do you have time? Most smiles faded right there. Others lingered, but cautiously, like Eli was a liability they'd have to tolerate. Caleb learned to recognize that look, the calculation, the quiet weighing of whether a single dad was worth the trouble. Loneliness settled in anyway. It crept into the empty chair at the dinner table, into the quiet house after Eli fell asleep, into the nights when Caleb stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind push against the siding, wondering if this was all life had left for him. The blind date came from a coworker who meant well and didn't understand what he was asking. Caleb said no 3 times, then yes once, because some part of him still remembered what it felt like to be seen as more than a responsibility. He told himself it was harmless. 1 coffee. 1 hour. No expectations. But as he drove toward the diner that night, rain streaking across the windshield, guilt sat heavy in his chest. Eli was at the babysitter's. Bills were due. Machines at work were barely holding together. And here he was, daring to want something for himself. Caleb didn't know yet that this single choice, this one attempt at normalcy, would test everything he'd built. And everything he was trying so hard not to lose. Victoria Hale chose the Briar Hollow Diner because it was quiet. At least, it was supposed to be. She sat alone in a corner booth, coat draped neatly beside her, tablet resting next to a cup of untouched tea. The place smelled like oil, coffee, and old wood. Small town familiar, functional, unpolished. Exactly what she expected from Briar Hollow. She'd been appointed regional operations executive 3 months earlier, flown in from a life of glass offices and catered meetings, and handed a simple directive dressed up as strategy. Cut costs. Improve efficiency. Decide what stayed and what didn't. The manufacturing plant on the edge of town was at the top of her list. Aging equipment. Thin margins. A workforce held together by habit more than performance. Tomorrow's town meeting would be tense, and Victoria wanted 1 quiet hour to prepare, to think through numbers and consequences without interruption. Then the door burst open. Cold air rushed in first, followed by a man who looked like he'd come straight from a 12-hour shift. Rain darkened his jacket. Grease stained his cuffs. His hair was still damp, his expression tight with something between worry and urgency. Victoria barely glanced up at first until she felt the room shift. People noticed him. Whispers followed. A chair scraped. Somewhere behind the counter, a plate clinked sharply against porcelain. Victoria's eyes tracked the man as he crossed the diner too fast, like someone already late for a problem that had started without him. He stopped near the back booth, where a woman stood awkwardly beside the table, her coat half on, her posture defensive. A small girl clung to her leg, eyes darting nervously around the room. Victoria frowned. She watched the man's face change when he saw the child. Surprise first. Then something unreadable, hesitation, maybe irritation. He glanced toward the counter, toward the manager, toward the exit. Unprepared, Victoria thought. Unprofessional. She'd seen the type before. Men who tried to balance too many things at once and dropped all of them. Men who let personal chaos spill into public spaces and expected understanding simply because they were overwhelmed. The diner manager stiffened, clearly unhappy. This wasn't a playground. This wasn't family night. The tension hung thick enough to taste. Victoria leaned back slightly, arms folding as she observed. This was the real Briar Hollow, she reminded herself, not the spreadsheets. Not the carefully worded reports. This awkward moments, blurred boundaries, poor judgment, was what inefficiency looked like when it wore a human face. The man spoke quietly to the woman. Victoria couldn't hear the words, but she saw the woman's shoulders tighten, saw embarrassment flash across her face. The child pressed closer, as if bracing for rejection she'd learned to expect. Victoria felt a flicker of discomfort but dismissed it. Business required distance. She made a mental note without even knowing his name. This is what happens when people can't separate work from life. Later that night, she would connect the dots. Because the next morning, standing on the cold concrete floor of the manufacturing plant, Victoria spotted the same man near a line of aging machinery. Same jacket. Same tired posture, same grease-stained hands. Caleb Mercer, someone said beside her, maintenance supervisor. Victoria's eyes narrowed just slightly. So this was him, the man from the diner. The one who couldn't even manage a simple dinner without chaos trailing behind him. She watched as he moved along the machines, checking gauges, listening closely to unfamiliar rattles, scribbling notes on a folded pad pulled from his pocket. He didn't look up when she passed, didn't try to impress her, didn't straighten his posture or wipe his hands. Another mark against him, she decided. When a supervisor whispered that Mercer was behind on maintenance reports, Victoria felt her impression harden. The plant couldn't afford mistakes, not with margins this thin. Not with corporate breathing down her neck for results. And people like Caleb Mercer, good intentions, messy execution, were liabilities. Still, she noticed things she didn't expect. When a junior worker nearly reached into a machine without shutting it down, Caleb snapped a warning fast and sharp, stepping in front of him without hesitation. When a belt slipped loose, Caleb didn't panic. He shut everything down methodically, prioritizing safety over speed. Victoria told herself that competence in moments didn't excuse disorder in life, but she couldn't shake the image of the child in the diner. The way Caleb had gone still when he saw her fear, the way his expression had softened, not into annoyance but into something else. Concern, maybe? Victoria pushed the thought away. Her job wasn't to read hearts, it was to make decisions. And, as far as she was concerned, Caleb Mercer was already starting from a deficit, one he didn't even realize he'd been judged for. Not yet. But soon. The failure started as a sound. A low, uneven grinding that didn't belong. Caleb Mercer heard it before anyone else did. He was halfway across the plant floor, boots echoing against concrete, when the vibration traveled up through his soles and into his chest. He stopped mid-step, head tilting slightly, eyes narrowing as he listened past the general roar of machines. That line shouldn't sound like that. Across the floor, a conveyor belt feeding one of the older presses shuddered, the rhythm slipping just enough to be dangerous. A young operator glanced around uncertainly, hand hovering near a control he wasn't trained to touch. Caleb moved fast, but not frantic. "Kill the feed," he called out, voice sharp and calm. "Now." The operator froze. "But we're already behind." "Now," Caleb repeated, already closing the distance. The belt jerked once more, metal screaming against metal. Sparks jumped. Someone cursed. Production supervisors shouted from the far end of the floor, panic creeping into their voices as the line slowed. Caleb reached the emergency cutoff and slammed it down. The plant groaned as the machinery powered off, a sudden silence ripping through the space. Everyone stared, including Victoria Hale. She stood on the raised platform with two plant managers beside her, tablet tucked under her arm, eyes locked on the darkened line. This inspection was supposed to prove the plant could still meet output targets. A full shutdown, especially during her walkthrough, was the last thing anyone wanted. One of the managers turned on Caleb, face red. "What are you doing? Do you know how much this costs per minute?" Caleb didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. "I know what it costs if that press tears itself apart," he said evenly, "or if someone loses a hand." The young operator swallowed hard, stepping back. Caleb crouched beside the belt, running his hand along the housing, eyes tracing oil streaks and worn bolts. "Bearings overheating," he said. "You can smell it. If we restart without replacing it, it'll seize." The manager scoffed. "We don't have time for a full repair." Caleb stood slowly. Then we don't have time to run it. Silence followed. Victoria watched closely now. This wasn't hesitation. This wasn't confusion. This was certainty, the kind built from years of listening to machines like they were living things. Caleb barked out instructions, assigning tasks with efficiency that surprised even the supervisors who'd worked beside him for years. Lock it out. Pull the spare from storage. I'll handle the alignment. Within minutes, chaos turned into controlled motion. Workers moved with purpose, eyes following Caleb's lead. No one questioned him. No one argued. They trusted him. Production was down, numbers were bleeding, but no one was in danger. Victoria felt the first crack in her certainty. She watched Caleb wipe his hands on a rag, kneel beside the open housing, and work with focused intensity. There was no showmanship, no glance in her direction. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was just doing his job. An hour later, when the line came back online smoothly, the same manager who'd been shouting earlier clapped Caleb on the shoulder. "You probably saved us a lawsuit," he muttered. Caleb nodded once, already moving on to the next issue. Victoria made a note on her tablet, but not the one she'd expected to write. Still, she stayed guarded. One good decision didn't erase risk. One calm moment didn't change the pressure she was under. She couldn't afford to let personal impressions sway operational judgment. Yet, as she turned to leave the floor, her mind drifted back to the diner. The small girl's grip on her mother's coat. The way her eyes had darted around the room, searching for safety. And the way Caleb had noticed, really noticed, before anyone else. Victoria had seen plenty of men react with annoyance in moments like that. Embarrassment, frustration. Caleb hadn't. He'd slowed. He'd softened. He'd stepped forward. Now she saw the same thing here. Not weakness. Not disorder. Responsibility. It unsettled her more than she liked. Because if Caleb Mercer was this careful with machines, this uncompromising about safety, this steady under pressure, then her first judgment of him might have been wrong. And if that was true, the decisions ahead were about to get a lot more complicated. The email hit Caleb's inbox just after lunch. He almost missed it, buried beneath maintenance requests and inventory alerts, but the subject line froze him where he stood. Incident review. Immediate action required. His stomach tightened as he opened it. The words blurred together at first, then sharpened into something ugly and unreal. A report had been filed claiming the machinery shut down during Victoria Hale's inspection had been mishandled. According to the document, Caleb had ignored protocol, caused unnecessary downtime, and exposed the company to financial loss through negligent decision-making. Caleb stared at the screen, heat creeping up his neck. Negligent? He read it again, slower this time. The report cited missing maintenance logs, delayed authorization, and an alleged verbal altercation with a supervisor who had questioned his judgment. None of it was true. Caleb closed his eyes and exhaled through his nose, forcing himself to stay calm. Someone had rewritten that moment, twisted it, cleaned themselves up by pushing him under the bus. Within an hour, the plant felt different. Conversations stopped when he walked by. Supervisors avoided eye contact. A few coworkers shot him sympathetic looks, but no one said anything out loud. Rumors moved faster than facts ever did, and by mid-afternoon, the story had already grown teeth. He shut the line down without approval. He's always cutting corners. Victoria Hale's looking for someone to blame. Caleb kept working because that was what he did. But every wrench felt heavier. Every sound from the machines carried a new edge of fear. He knew how this ended. He'd seen it before. One report became an investigation. An investigation became a decision already made behind closed doors. And people like him didn't get the benefit of doubt. That evening, his phone buzzed while he was locking up his toolbox. Naomi. He hesitated before answering, already bracing himself. "Hey," he said softly. There was a pause on the other end. Caleb, I heard something today. His jaw tightened. From where? A friend of mine works at the municipal office. She said there was talk about trouble at the plant. About you. Caleb leaned against the locker, the cold metal seeping through his jacket. It's not what it sounds like. Another pause. Longer this time. I believe you, Naomi said, but her voice wavered. I don't know if this is a good time for us. For my daughter. There it was. The careful wording. The distance sliding quietly into place. I understand, Caleb said, even though his chest ached. I'd never want to put her in the middle of anything. I'm sorry, she whispered. She's already been through enough. After the call ended, Caleb stared at his phone for a long moment before slipping it into his pocket. He didn't feel angry at Naomi. Fear made people cautious. He understood that better than most. But it still felt like losing ground he hadn't even realized he'd claimed. At home, Eli was sprawled on the living room floor with his homework, tongue poking out in concentration. Caleb forced a smile, hung up his jacket, and sat beside him. How was school? He asked. Good, Eli said, then looked up. Dad, are we okay? The question hit harder than any report. Caleb swallowed. Yeah, buddy. We're okay. Eli studied his face like he was learning a new language. You promise? Caleb pulled him close, resting his chin on the top of Eli's head. I promise I'll do everything I can. But promises felt fragile tonight. Later, when Eli was asleep, Caleb sat at the kitchen table staring at the rent notice taped to the fridge. 2 weeks late, final reminder. If he lost his job, he'd have nothing to show a judge if things went sideways. He knew how these systems worked. Financial instability raised flags. Flags turned into reviews. Reviews didn't care about good intentions or bedtime routines. They cared about numbers. The next morning, Victoria Hale was called into a conference with corporate leadership. Faces on a screen. Voices tight with pressure. The plant's margins are already unacceptable, one executive said. Now we're seeing internal breakdowns. Victoria listened, jaw set. We need accountability, another voice added. Someone needs to be made an example of. The board wants reassurance. She knew exactly who they meant. Caleb Mercer was an easy answer, a single supervisor. No connections, no leverage. Already rumored to be disorganized. Already under suspicion from that night at the diner, an image she hadn't quite shaken. Termination would send a clear message, the executive continued. Victoria's fingers tightened around her pen. She thought of the machinery incident, the calm, the precision, the fact that no one had been hurt because Caleb had acted when others hesitated. She thought of the report too, the inconsistencies, the missing timestamps, the way it leaned heavily on hearsay instead of data. I'll review the findings personally, Victoria said evenly, before any decisions are made. The screen went quiet for a beat. We don't have time for hesitation, someone said. Victoria met the camera without blinking. And I don't make decisions without facts. After the call ended, she sat back, heart pounding. The pressure was real. If she pushed back and was wrong, it would land on her. But if she didn't, she remembered the child at the diner, the way fear had looked on her face, and she wondered what would happen to Caleb Mercer's child if she chose the easy path. Back at the plant, Caleb was called into a meeting. HR. Management. A formal tone that stripped away any illusion of fairness. He was placed on temporary suspension pending review. His badge was collected. When he walked out, coworkers watched in silence. Caleb drove home in a daze, the world outside his windshield muted and unreal. By the time he pulled into the driveway, his hands were shaking. Inside, Eli ran to him, arms wide. Caleb dropped to one knee and held him tight, breathing in the familiar scent of soap and crayons. Everything he'd built, every early morning, every sacrifice, every quiet act of care, felt like it was teetering on the edge of collapse. And for the first time since Eli's mother died, Caleb didn't know if working harder would be enough to save them. The days after the suspension blurred together in a way that made time feel heavy and useless. Caleb stopped waking up to an alarm because there was nowhere to be. The silence in the house pressed in on him, louder than the machines ever were. He still got up early. Habit was hard to kill, but now he sat at the kitchen table staring at the same stack of envelopes, knowing exactly what each one said without opening them. Past due. Final notice. Call immediately. He stretched what little money remained like it was elastic, cutting corners that already felt worn thin. No meat at the grocery store. Generic cereal. The thermostat stayed low even when the mornings turned sharp with cold. He told Eli it was a camping week, trying to make the shiver feel like an adventure. Eli didn't laugh. Children always knew when pretending was happening. One afternoon, while Caleb was on the phone with the landlord, Eli sat at the small table coloring quietly. Caleb kept his voice low, back turned, pressing his fingers into his temple as he listened. "I understand," Caleb said. "I'm not refusing. I just need time." A pause. His shoulders slumped. "No, I don't have family who can help," he said. "It's just me." Another pause, longer this time. "Yes, I know what the lease says." He ended the call without saying goodbye and stood there, breathing slowly, trying to keep his chest from tightening too much. Behind him, a crayon rolled off the table and hit the floor. Caleb turned. Eli was watching him, not with curiosity, but with something older, something careful. "Dad," Eli said softly, "are we going to move again?" The words landed like a punch. Caleb crossed the room in 2 steps and knelt in front of him. "Why would you think that, buddy?" Eli shrugged, eyes dropping to his hands. "You sounded like before." "When we had to leave the other house." Caleb swallowed hard. He remembered that night too well. Boxes everywhere. Eli crying because he didn't want to leave his room. Promises Caleb hadn't been sure he could keep. "No," Caleb said quickly, forcing steadiness into his voice. "We're not moving." Eli searched his face. "You sure?" Caleb pulled him into a hug, holding him tighter than usual. "I'm sure I'm doing everything I can." Eli nodded, but he didn't look convinced. That night, after Eli fell asleep, Caleb sat in his truck parked at the edge of the empty lot behind the house. The engine was off, the windows fogged from his breath. Streetlights cast long shadows across the hood. He stared at the steering wheel until his eyes burned. He'd always believed that if he just worked harder, stayed quieter, caused less trouble than anyone else, things would eventually stabilize. That responsibility would be rewarded. That doing the right thing would count for something. Now he wasn't so sure. His phone buzzed with a notification he didn't open. Another email. Another reminder of everything he couldn't fix fast enough. Caleb leaned forward, resting his forehead against the wheel. The sound that came out of him surprised even himself, a broken, silent gasp that turned into something wet and shaking. He pressed his fist to his mouth, shoulders trembling, tears spilling before he could stop them. He cried for the job, for the routine, for the safety he thought he built, but mostly he cried for Eli. Because if Caleb failed, it wouldn't just be his pride that shattered, it would be his son's sense of home. His sense of security, the fragile belief that his dad could always make things okay. The thought of fighting felt exhausting. Meetings, investigations, proving himself to people who had already decided he wasn't worth the trouble. For the first time, the idea of giving up crept in, not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly. Maybe he should just accept whatever they decided. Maybe pushing back would only make things worse. Maybe stability meant knowing when to stop fighting. He sat there a long time wrestling with that thought. Eventually, his phone rang. He almost didn't answer. It was Eli's school, just a reminder about a permission slip. Nothing urgent, nothing terrible. But hearing his son's name spoken aloud snapped something back into place. Caleb wiped his face, straightened, and took a deep breath. Giving up might be easier, but it wasn't an option. Because tomorrow morning, Eli would wake up and look to him for answers, for steadiness, for proof that the world wasn't falling apart. Caleb started the engine, the familiar rumble grounding him just enough. He didn't know how he would fix this. He only knew that as long as his son believed in him, he couldn't stop trying, even if it felt like he was standing at the very bottom, staring up at a climb he wasn't sure he had the strength to make. The town hall meeting was already tense before Caleb Mercer walked in. The old civic center smelled like dust and floor cleaner, rows of folding chairs packed with workers, spouses, and a few reporters who had heard rumors of trouble at the plant. Voices overlapped in low, anxious murmurs. This wasn't just about machinery or profit margins. It was about jobs, about whether Briar Hollow would keep breathing or slowly bleed out. Caleb took a seat near the back, shoulders squared but tight. He hadn't wanted to come. Suspension paperwork had made it clear he wasn't required to attend. But staying home, waiting for other people to decide his fate, had felt worse. He thought of Eli eating cereal at the kitchen table that morning, trying to act normal. Thought of the way his son had hugged him before school, just a little longer than usual. Caleb folded his hands together to keep them from shaking. Up front, Victoria Halleck stood beside a projector screen, her posture composed, face unreadable. She scanned the room slowly before speaking, letting the noise die down on its own. "Thank you for coming," she said. Her voice carried calm, professional, but firm. "I know there's concern about recent events at the manufacturing plant. Tonight is about transparency." A few people shifted in their seats. Someone scoffed quietly. Victoria clicked the remote. The screen lit up with a still image of the press line, the same one that had been shut down during her inspection. "Last week," she continued, "there was a reported safety incident that led to downtime and an internal review." Caleb felt eyes flick toward him. He kept his gaze forward. "The initial report," Victoria said, "claimed the shutdown was mishandled, that protocols were ignored." She paused. "After reviewing the data myself, I found discrepancies." A murmur rippled through the room. The screen changed. Time-stamped sensor logs appeared, temperature spikes, vibration readings, maintenance alerts. "These readings show a bearing failure in progress," Victoria explained. "If the line had continued running, the risk of catastrophic damage or serious injury was high." Caleb's chest tightened. This was it. Facts, not rumors. Victoria clicked again. Video footage played from a security camera above the line. Caleb appeared on screen, moving quickly, signaling workers back, slamming the emergency cutoff. "He acted immediately," Victoria said. "And correctly." Someone near the front whispered, "That's Mercer." The video froze, then cut to another document. "This," Victoria said, her tone sharpening, "is the incident report submitted afterward." Lines of text highlighted in red. Missing timestamps. Altered sequences. "Several statements in this report contradict the data," she said, including claims that authorization was ignored and that warnings were dismissed. The room grew still. Victoria took a breath. Further review confirmed that this report was falsified. Gasps. Someone cursed under their breath. A supervisor near the aisle shifted uncomfortably as his name appeared on the screen. The same man who had shouted at Caleb on the floor. The same man who'd insisted they didn't have time to stop the line. "He altered records to shift blame," Victoria said, "and in doing so, put this entire plant at risk." The man stood abruptly. "That's not—" "Sit down," Victoria said, not raising her voice, but cutting through the noise like steel. He sat. Victoria turned slightly, her gaze finding Caleb in the back row. "Caleb Mercer," she said. Caleb stood slowly, heart pounding. "In front of this community," she continued, "I want to say this clearly. You did your job. You prevented an accident. And you were wrongfully accused." The words hit harder than he expected. "I authorized your suspension based on incomplete information," Victoria said. "That was my failure. The room was silent now. "I apologize," she said, and this time there was no distance in her voice. Publicly. Caleb swallowed, his vision blurred for a second. He hadn't imagined this moment, not like this. Victoria faced the room again. Effective immediately, Caleb Mercer is reinstated. The falsified report will be addressed, and accountability will fall where it belongs. Something shifted in the air. Suspicion loosened its grip. People nodded. A few clapped, hesitant at first, then stronger. Caleb didn't move. For days, he'd carried the weight of being seen as careless, as disposable. Now, in front of everyone, the truth stood where rumors had been. Victoria stepped away from the podium and walked toward him. "You chose safety over speed," she said quietly, close enough now that only he could hear. "That matters." Caleb met her eyes. "It always has." She nodded once. As he sat back down, coworkers turned toward him, not with pity, but respect. Real respect, the kind that didn't need explaining. Caleb thought of Eli, of telling him tonight that sometimes the truth did come out. Sometimes doing the right thing was enough. For the first time in weeks, the tightness in his chest eased. He wasn't invisible anymore, and he wasn't alone. The changes didn't happen all at once. There was no sudden celebration, no instant relief that erased the weeks of strain. But the morning after the town hall, Caleb Mercer woke up with something he hadn't felt in a long time, ground beneath his feet. His reinstatement came with conditions, formal, careful, written in language that covered the company more than it praised him. But there was something else too, a quiet acknowledgement. Caleb was given expanded oversight of safety procedures across multiple lines, more responsibility, more trust. Not a promotion that changed his life overnight, but one that told him he wasn't just tolerated. He was valued. The paycheck didn't fix everything immediately. Bills still waited. Rent still had to be negotiated. But the landlord listened this time. A payment plan replaced threats. The fridge slowly filled back up. Meat returned to the grocery list. The thermostat clicked higher on cold mornings without guilt following close behind. Eli noticed before Caleb said anything. "You're not tired like before," Eli said one night, chewing thoughtfully on a slice of toast. Caleb smiled. "I'm still tired, buddy." Eli shook his head. Different tired. Caleb knew exactly what he meant. At the plant, the atmosphere shifted. People greeted him openly now. Questions were asked instead of ignored. When Caleb spoke during meetings, others listened. Even supervisors who had once brushed him off nodded along, taking notes. The man who falsified the report was gone within the week. No announcement, no spectacle. Just an empty locker and a quiet understanding that integrity had teeth after all. One evening, as Caleb locked up his toolbox, his phone buzzed. Naomi. He stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "Hey," she said. Her voice sounded lighter, less guarded. "I watched the town hall stream," she continued. "I'm really sorry I pulled back. I was scared. I didn't want my daughter caught in something unstable." Caleb leaned against the wall, exhaling. "I get it. I shouldn't have disappeared," she said. "You didn't deserve that." There was a pause, then softer. "If you're willing, maybe we could try again." Slowly. With honesty. Caleb smiled, a real one this time. "I'd like that." They started with simple things. A walk in the park. Ice cream, with both kids in tow. No pressure. No pretending complications didn't exist. Naomi's daughter warmed to Caleb quickly, remembering the man who'd noticed her fear in the diner. Eli, shy at first, followed her lead. Laughter came easier when there was space for it. At home, the house felt different too. Not bigger, not fancier. Just lighter. Caleb stopped bracing for the next disaster. He stopped checking his bank balance 3 times a day. Nights were quieter, not because worries were gone, but because they no longer screamed. The manufacturing plant survived. Contracts were renegotiated. Equipment upgrades were approved in stages. It wasn't a miracle. It was work. Slow, deliberate work, the kind that lasted because it was built on truth instead of shortcuts. One evening, Caleb sat on the porch steps while Eli did homework beside him, pencil scratching steadily across paper. "Dad?" Eli asked. "Yeah? You're going to be okay now, right?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He looked at his son's face, hopeful, careful, trusting. "I'm okay now," he said. "And we are too." Eli nodded, satisfied, and went back to his homework. Caleb leaned back, watching the sun dip behind the trees, feeling the quiet weight of dignity settle back where it belonged. Life hadn't turned perfect, but it had turned stable. And for a single dad who'd spent years holding everything together with sheer will, that was more than enough. Morning light crept through the thin curtains, soft and unhurried, settling into the small kitchen like it belonged there. Caleb Mercer stood at the stove in socked feet, flipping pancakes with more confidence than skill. One sizzled a little too long, edges darkening before he caught it. He frowned at it for half a second, then shrugged and slid it onto a plate anyway. "Dad," Eli said from the table, grinning, "that one's extra crispy." "That's called flavor," Caleb replied, deadpan. Eli laughed, the sound easy and bright, the kind that filled a room without trying. Caleb packed a lunch while the coffee brewed, folding a napkin just right, tucking in an extra apple because he could now. No rushing. No bracing for bad news. Just morning. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, no moving trucks. No eviction notices taped to doors. The world felt steady. Caleb glanced at the calendar on the fridge work shift, marked, school events circled, plans penciled in instead of erased. It wasn't fancy. It was real, and it was theirs. Eli slung his backpack over one shoulder and paused at the door. "Hey, Dad?" "Yeah, buddy." Eli hesitated, then smiled. "I like our mornings now." Caleb swallowed past the tightness in his throat and nodded. "Me too." After the door closed, Caleb stood alone in the kitchen for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the house. He thought about how close he'd come to losing all of this, not because he was careless, but because the truth had almost been buried under noise. He washed the pan, scraped the burnt bits free, and smiled to himself. Life wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was safe, and it was honest. And it was built on staying when it mattered, and sometimes that was everything. If this story touched you, subscribe to JustDadThings for more single dad stories, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.